"Sir, you need to leave this seat now," the guard said, his voice steady, rehearsed. "There's a ceremony today, and you don't belong here." The old man looked up from his bench, hands folded over the wooden cane he'd carried since Vietnam. He nodded once and rose without complaint, but just as they moved to guide him out, the door at the end of the hall swung open and a general stepped in, his gaze falling on the old man's sleeve. What happened next would change the way everyone in that room remembered Silence. Welcome to Grateful Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. The cold of early December had settled over Nashville, Tennessee. The kind of cold that made even the stone walls of the Veterans Heritage Museum feel like they were holding their breath. Inside, the air was warm but tense, humming with the low murmur of visitors and the quiet shuffle of boots on polished floors. Today was no ordinary day. Today was the Paratrooper Remembrance Day, an event that had drawn in not just curious families and history buffs, but a full delegation of high-ranking officers, led by Major General Richard Garrison himself. Security was tight, tighter than usual, and the museum staff were on edge, their eyes sweeping the halls for anything that looked out of place. Frank Mercer, 79 years old, walked slowly through the front doors. His coat was a weathered brown, shoulders faded where the sun had beat down on him over the years. In his right hand, he leaned on a cane, tapping gently on the marble as he moved forward. There was no ticket in his pocket, no wristband clipped around his wrist. He had come here every December for 30 years, and he had never needed one. The guards near the entrance clocked him immediately. Young, fit, dressed in dark blue jackets that bore the museum's crest. They stood a little straighter as he passed. Frank was used to it. These days, an old man moving slowly always seemed to draw glances, either of polite indifference or cautious suspicion. But Frank wasn't here to cause trouble. He kept his head down, nodding politely to a woman with a stroller as she stepped aside to let him pass. He didn't join the crowd gathered around the new exhibit near the entrance, where a giant photograph of a C-47 in flight hung like a silent promise of history remembered. Instead, Frank moved to the side hallway where the memorial wall rose from floor to ceiling, black glass panels etched with the names of paratroopers lost in wars too distant for many to recall. He stopped in front of it, let the quiet settle around him like a blanket. The colors of the American flag above the wall had drooped slightly overnight. Frank noticed. He always noticed. He shifted his cane to his left hand and reached up, smoothing the edge of the flag with careful fingers. The cloth was cold under his touch, and he took a breath, steady and slow. In his other hand, he held a single white carnation. He bent down, knees cracking like old doors, and placed it at the base of the glass, right beneath the name of a friend he hadn't spoken aloud in decades. For a moment, he just stood there. The crowd at the front of the museum was out of sight, and the sound of their voices was nothing more than a muffled echo down the corridor. He liked it that way, no noise, no eyes, just a quiet place to remember. He didn't see the two young guards exchanging glances behind him. They were under orders today, orders to keep the museum pristine. Every movement accounted for, every inch of floor space under watchful eyes. With General Garrison scheduled to arrive at any minute, the stakes felt higher. One of them spoke into his radio, his voice low. "He's not on the guest list," he said. "Older man, no badge, just standing at the memorial wall." The other guard nodded, shifting his weight. "We should probably ask him to leave," he said, and there was no malice in it, just the rehearsed caution of men told to follow rules that left little room for exceptions. Frank didn't hear them. He was too focused on the small act of adjusting the flag, the flower at his feet. A lifetime of service had taught him how to stand in the background, how to be part of a place without taking it over. Around the corner, a school group moved in clusters, their chaperone holding up a program and reading off names that meant nothing to them. A few of the kids glanced his way, curious for a heartbeat, then lost in the shuffle of their friends. Frank adjusted the sleeve of his coat, feeling the weight of the patch hidden underneath a patch so worn that the eagle had almost vanished. But he knew it was there. 101st Airborne. It wasn't a boast. It was a memory. He let out a breath and looked back at the wall, eyes scanning the names one more time. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Just a name, mouthed in silence. A young woman in a museum vest walked past, eyes darting to the cane, the flower. She paused, her hand resting on a small clipboard, then moved on, as if unsure whether to interrupt or not. Frank appreciated that. Not everyone needed to understand what he was doing. Not everyone needed to see it. He shifted his weight and took a small step back, giving the flag one last look. His knees ached with the cold, but he didn't mind. Some pain was worth carrying. The guards approached together, their steps careful, measured. One of them cleared his throat gently. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his voice polite but edged with the kind of firmness that comes from knowing he was being watched. "Do you have a reservation for today's event?" Frank looked up at him, blinking once, the question hanging in the cold air. He didn't bristle, didn't flinch. He just shook his head. "I've come here for years," he said softly. "I just wanted to sit for a while." The guard hesitated, glancing at his partner, then back at Frank. "I'm sorry, sir," he said. "Today's event is closed to the public. It's by invitation only." Frank nodded once, slowly. "I understand," he said. His voice was calm, the same tone he'd used decades ago, giving orders over the roar of helicopter blades. He didn't argue, didn't make a scene. He reached up, adjusting the sleeve of his jacket again, and in that simple movement, the patch, old, almost threadbare, slipped into view. For a moment, the younger guard's eyes flickered to it. Recognition, maybe, or just curiosity. But before he could say anything, the radio on his shoulder crackled, a voice reminding them to keep things moving. The general was due any minute, and there was no room for questions. Frank took one last look at the names on the wall. His eyes softened, his mouth set in a thin line that spoke of things he'd never said out loud. Then he turned, his cane tapping lightly against the marble floor, and began to walk away. Not because he wanted to, but because he understood. Outside, the wind rattled the flagpoles, the morning sun glinting off the glass of the museum's front doors. And behind him, the white carnation lay bright and alone beneath the black glass. One small, quiet promise in a world that had almost forgotten how to listen. Frank didn't get far before he settled onto a wooden bench near the memorial wall. He let his cane rest against the arm, hands folded over the handle like he was holding something more than a simple piece of wood. His breath steamed in the cold air, drifting in from the main hall, but he didn't seem to notice. A young museum attendant noticed him after a few minutes. She had the quick, clipped steps of someone new to the job, still unsure when to speak and when to just keep moving. She paused at the end of the hall, eyes flicking from the bench to the small reserved for ceremony sign that sat politely on a stand a few feet away. She frowned. The bench was supposed to be cleared today, just for the VIP guests arriving with the general. But the man sitting there didn't seem to care, or maybe didn't know. She approached slowly, voice gentle but edged with nervous authority. "Excuse me, sir," she said, clearing her throat. "This area is reserved for a private ceremony. Do you have a guest pass for today's event?" Frank looked up at her, eyes patient and a little tired. "I'm just resting a moment," he said softly. His voice was calm, warm in the cold echo of the hall. The girl hesitated, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. She didn't want to push, but the orders had been clear. Everything had to be perfect today. General Garrison and his staff were already in the building, final checks happening in the main exhibit hall. No mistakes, no one out of place. She radioed quietly to one of the security guards stationed near the entrance. "There's an older gentleman here," she said. "He doesn't have a badge. He's sitting in the reserved area." Within minutes, two guards approached, young men in neatly pressed blazers, eyes watchful but polite. One spoke first, voice steady. "Sir, I'm sorry," he said, "but we need to ask you to leave this section. It's for invited guests only today." Frank didn't argue. He nodded once, a small, almost apologetic smile on his lips. "Of course," he said simply, hands gripping the handle of his cane. As he leaned forward to stand, the guard closest to him reached out, laying a firm but careful hand on his elbow. It wasn't rough, just a practiced touch meant to guide, not to harm, but it was enough to make Frank pause. He shifted his weight and, almost as an afterthought, adjusted the sleeve of his coat. The fabric bunched up just enough to reveal the faded patch sewn into the lining of 101st Airborne insignia. Edges frayed but still proud. The guard froze for a heartbeat, eyes darting to the patch and then back to Frank's face. He didn't say anything. Maybe he didn't understand the weight of what he was seeing, or maybe he wasn't sure how to react. Behind them, a small group of older men had been watching quietly. Veterans, gathered in honor of the day, their own jackets heavy with patches and pins. They saw the insignia. They knew what it meant. One of them, a man with silver hair and a cane of his own, shifted his stance, his expression softening as he met Frank's gaze. He didn't speak, didn't move forward, but he nodded once, a silent sign of respect that didn't need words. Frank caught the nod and returned it, a small dip of his head that said, "Everything I see you? I remember." He let the guard's hand fall away, moving slowly but steadily as he stood. His legs ached with the effort, but he didn't let it show. For a moment, he looked back at the flower he'd left beneath the glass wall, white against the black marble, and his breath caught in his throat. In that brief pause, memory rushed up around him. The echo of helicopters overhead, the crackle of distant gunfire, the smell of damp earth and sweat. He was young again, dirt-smeared and bone-tired, gripping the hand of a friend who would never see home again. He blinked, the memory fading as quickly as it came, replaced by the quiet hush of the museum. A small group of school children passed by on their way to the exhibit hall, their laughter bouncing off the walls. They didn't notice Frank, just another old man, just another shadow in a place built to remember. The guards guided him gently away from the bench, leading him back down the hall. He didn't resist. He didn't even look back. The veterans who had been watching followed him with their eyes, their own memories flickering behind solemn gazes. At the far end of the hall, the double doors to the main exhibit opened with a quiet click. Voices carried from the other side low and formal, the cadence of officers and staff checking final details before the ceremony began. Frank paused, just for a second, at the edge of that doorway. He could see the general's staff moving in precise lines, polished shoes clicking on the marble, the quiet authority of men and women trained to see every detail. He knew he didn't belong there, not today, not when everything had been planned and ordered, every chair lined up and every minute accounted for. So he turned, adjusting the sleeve of his coat once more, and moved back into the side corridor. The guard who had touched his arm watched him go, his face a study in uncertainty. There was a question in his eyes, but he didn't ask it. In the quiet that followed, Frank let out a slow breath. His shoulders slumped just a little, but he kept his head high. He moved to another bench farther down the hall, one not marked for VIPs, and settled there, cane across his knees. The flower was gone from his hand, but the memory of it stayed with him, a small act, a small promise. As he sat, he let his eyes wander the faces of the visitors passing by. Young soldiers in dress blues, civilians with cameras slung around their necks, children too busy looking for gift shop trinkets to notice the names on the wall. And he thought of the man he'd been, the men he'd known, the things they'd done that no one would ever see in a museum display. His fingers brushed the patch at his sleeve, feeling the threads worn thin by time. In that simple gesture, he found a measure of comfort, a quiet reminder that even if the world had moved on, some things were still worth carrying. The young guard stood at the edge of the hall, watching him one last time before turning back to his post. The ceremony would begin soon. The general and his staff would file in. The museum would hush to a reverent silence, and Frank would fade into the background, as he always had. But for now, in this small moment of waiting, he was content to sit quietly, to remember, to honor. And though no one said it out loud, the quiet nods of the veterans nearby spoke volumes, an unbroken line of respect that didn't need orders or invitations to stand tall. The guard's hand hovered near Frank's elbow, ready to guide him gently but firmly out of the main corridor. There was a stiffness in the young man's posture, the sense that he was only following orders, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. Frank met that flicker with a calm gaze, neither defiant nor resigned, just steady, as if to say he understood. Before the guard could say another word, the double doors to the main hall swung open with a quiet, deliberate click. Light spilled from the room, catching on polished metals and the brass edges of a dozen dress uniforms. The shift in air was almost physical, like a hush that fell over the entire wing of the museum. Major General Richard Garrison stepped into the hallway, flanked by a small contingent of officers in deep blue service coats. Their movements were purposeful, shoulders squared, the gravity of the day mirrored in their composed silence. The general's eyes swept the room as he walked. He missed nothing. Each step measured but never hurried. The guard's hand dropped away from Frank's arm at once, instinctively straightening to attention as the general approached. The air around them grew still, the soft murmurs of conversation from the other visitors falling away into a quiet that hummed like the low note of a hymn. General Garrison's gaze moved down the line of visitors, pausing when it reached Frank. For a moment, his eyes lingered on the old man's face, on the calm dignity that had always been there, even if the world hadn't seen it. Then the general's eyes dropped to the worn patch on Frank's coat sleeve. The eagle of the 101st Airborne was faded almost to the threads, but it was unmistakable. Something shifted in Garrison's expression, an almost imperceptible catch of breath, the weight of memory pulling at the edges of his composure. He stepped forward, the metals on his chest catching the light as he closed the distance between them. His voice was quiet but carried the authority of a man who had never needed to raise it. "Are you Frank Mercer?" he asked. The words simple but heavy with something deeper. The entire hallway seemed to freeze around them. The guard stood motionless, hand hovering just above his belt. The veterans nearby straightened their shoulders as if called to attention by an invisible command. Even the group of school children fell silent, eyes wide with a curiosity they didn't yet have the words to explain. Frank didn't move for a moment, his fingers resting lightly on the handle of his cane. Then he lifted his chin, his mouth curved in a small, quiet smile. "Yes, sir," he said softly, the syllables careful and respectful. General Garrison let out a slow breath, his shoulders easing just a fraction. "My father," he said, and there was a flicker of something like wonder in his voice. "He used to speak of you, said you carried him half a mile under fire, refused to leave him behind at Khe Sanh." A ripple moved through the group of veterans, their eyes meeting in silent acknowledgement. They had all heard stories like that, stories that rarely made it into the record books, but lived on in the quiet spaces of memory. Frank's smile was faint, his eyes gentle as he looked back at the general. "Your father was a good man," he said quietly, as if that was all that needed to be said. His tone was one of reverence, not pride like he was remembering a brother, not recounting a victory. General Garrison reached up slowly, pressing a hand over the eagle insignia pinned to his own uniform. For a moment, he said nothing. The only sound in the hall, the quiet rustle of the flag hanging above the memorial wall. "I owe you more than I can say," he said finally. His voice was steady, but there was a softness in it, an undercurrent of gratitude that no official speech could ever touch. Frank didn't answer with words. He simply dipped his head in a small bow, the gesture humble but resolute. In that small act, the meaning of the moment became clear to everyone watching. This was not about medals or ceremonies. It was about something deeper, something earned in the dirt and the dark, in the places where men learned what it meant to be family without ever saying the word. The general's officers stood silent behind him, their faces composed but their eyes bright with something unspoken. One of them, a young captain with close-cropped hair and a row of ribbons that spoke of hard years, shifted his stance slightly, as if to better see the man who had carried one of their own when the world was on fire. The veterans near the wall moved as one, their shoulders squaring, heads lifting in quiet respect. No one said anything. They didn't need to. The weight of the silence was enough, filling the space with a reverence that no uniform could command. Frank lifted his gaze once more, his eyes meeting the general's. "I just did what needed doing," he said softly. There was no false modesty in his voice, no need to make the moment smaller than it was. Just a simple truth, offered plainly. General Garrison gave a small, solemn nod. "Sometimes," he said, "that's everything." His hand fell to his side, the edges of his posture softening. Then he turned to the guard who had tried to move Frank along, his expression calm but resolute. "Leave him be," he said quietly. "He belongs here more than any of us." The guard swallowed hard, his face pale as he nodded once, stepping back with the kind of deference that couldn't be taught, only learned. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, the veterans near the memorial wall raised their hands to their brows in a silent salute. The motion was fluid, almost choreographed, but it wasn't for show. It was for him. Frank sat a little taller on the bench, his cane across his knees, his shoulders set in quiet dignity. He didn't return the salute. He had never been comfortable with that kind of attention. But the small smile at the corners of his mouth said everything he needed to say. In that moment, the museum was silent. The noise of the city outside, the murmur of visitors, it all fell away. There was only the weight of memory, the soft light on black glass, and the understanding that some debts were paid not in medals or plaques, but in the simple act of standing when others might have walked away. The general took a step back, his officers following his lead as he gave Frank a final nod. Then he turned to the gathered staff, his voice calm but carrying. "Let's continue," he said. "Let's honor them the way they deserve." As the group moved past, the veterans and the school children followed, their footsteps quiet in the echoing hall. But for a few moments more, the only figure that didn't move was Frank. He sat in the silence he'd always kept close, the small patch on his sleeve speaking louder than any words he might have said. And in that quiet, everything was finally seen. General Garrison took one last step closer, his boots quiet against the marble. He rested a hand on Frank's shoulder, fingers firm but gentle, a weight that was more about honor than ceremony. In that simple touch, there was a message that didn't need words, an unspoken acknowledgement of debts carried and debts repaid. Around them, the officers straightened as one, their shoulders squared, their eyes steady as they stood in silent tribute. It wasn't a command, not something drilled into them by rank, it was instinct. A collective understanding that some moments deserved nothing less than complete, unwavering respect. The museum staff, caught in the gravity of the scene, shifted in place. One of the docents, a young man who had watched the whole exchange unfold, moved quickly to the storage room and returned a minute later with a small plaque. He cradled it in both hands as if it were fragile, though it was nothing more than a simple piece of bronze. He approached slowly, his footsteps hesitant but sure. He set the plaque down on the bench where Frank still sat, the inscription catching the warm light of the hall. "Reserved for those who served." It read in letters so simple they might have been whispered. Frank didn't speak as the plaque was placed beside him. He didn't need to. His hand closed around the handle of his cane, knuckles white with the strength of a man who had given so much and asked for so little in return. He sat still, the hush of the room pressing close around him. His eyes never left the memorial wall. The names etched there, a litany of memories he carried like a second skin. For a long moment, he simply looked, the small white carnation still at his side, the symbol of a promise he had kept for decades. The afternoon light shifted as the sun dipped lower in the sky. Rays of amber and gold filtered through the high windows, catching on the worn patch of the 101st Airborne on his sleeve. The threads glowed in the quiet light, a flicker of something that refused to be forgotten. A few feet away, a small group of school children watched with wide eyes. One of them, a boy with a shy, earnest face, lifted a phone to take a picture of the bench. The chaperone leaned down, whispering a soft explanation. The boy nodded solemnly, his hands steady as he captured the image. Not for social media, not for likes or shares, just to remember. The veterans nearby shifted as the ceremony in the main hall began. Their heads turned toward the muted sounds of the bugle, but their bodies remained rooted in place. For them, this quiet tribute was the heart of the day, more real than any scripted words. Frank's shoulders rose and fell with a deep breath. His eyes glistened, though no tears fell. He reached down slowly, his fingers brushing the white carnation at his side. He lifted it carefully, cradling it in the crook of his hand like it was something sacred. The flower was simple, but it was enough. It was his offering, his final salute to the brothers he had left behind in places too far away for most to imagine. He set it down again, tucking it into a small crease in the bench where it wouldn't be swept away. General Garrison stepped back, his hand falling away from Frank's shoulder. He didn't say another word, but the respect in his eyes was enough. He turned to his officers, nodding once, and they moved away as one quiet, deliberate, leaving Frank to the space he had claimed. The guards who had once tried to move him watched in silence. One of them, the young man who had touched Frank's arm, lowered his gaze, shame softening his features. But Frank didn't hold it against him. There was no room for anger in this place, only remembrance. The hush of the hallway lingered, a soft echo of footsteps and the distant murmur of the main ceremony. But at the bench, the world had narrowed to a single point of quiet reverence. Frank closed his eyes for a moment, letting the memories settle like dust on an old photograph. He wasn't there for the medals or the speeches. He was there for the names on the wall, the echoes of laughter and fear and sacrifice that no plaque could ever capture fully. When he opened his eyes, the light had changed again. It caught the brass edge of the plaque beside him, the words "those who served" gleaming like a small, stubborn flame. The boy with the phone took another picture, this time of Frank himself. He didn't ask permission, but something in the old man's calm acceptance told him it was all right. The boy's small act was a promise, one more link in the chain of memory that stretched across generations. Frank didn't move to stand. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. The years had etched lines into his face, but his back remained straight, his hands steady on the cane that had carried him this far. The last rays of the sun slipped through the windows, warming the cold stone of the museum's walls. In that final light, the patch on Frank's sleeve seemed to glow faded, but unbowed, a testament to what it meant to stand for something, and to never let it go. Around him, the world moved on. The children were led away by their teacher, their chatter hushed. The veterans drifted toward the main hall, ready to hear the names spoken aloud once more. But Frank stayed where he was, the small plaque beside him and the memory of a promise kept close to his heart. In the end, it wasn't the speeches or the ceremony that mattered most. It was the quiet dignity of a man who had shown up, year after year, not for glory, but for the simple act of remembering. And as the museum's doors swung shut behind the last of the day's visitors, the bench remained there in the fading light, marked now, not just by the brass plaque, but by the quiet weight of a life lived in service and honor. The world outside the glass would move on. The headlines would shift to other things. But for those who had seen, for those who had paused long enough to truly look, that small corner of the museum would always be different, not because of a medal or a speech, but because of the quiet strength of a man who sat and remembered and carried forward the weight of those who could no longer sit beside him. In the hush that followed, that was enough, and it would be remembered. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way, often in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition. Some just need to know that today, someone isn't going hungry. And sometimes, That alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to Grateful Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.